We're going to use base 10 blocks to represent decimals. You're used to calling this block a 1,000 block, but for decimals we're going to call this a 1 block. This represents one whole. How many of these flats does it take to make one of these blocks? It takes 10, so we're going to call this a tenth because it takes 10 of them. How many of these rods does it take to make up our 1 block? Well, it would take 100 of them, and so therefore we call this a hundredth. And how many of these little tiny cubes does it take to make up our ones block? Well, it takes 1,000 of them, so we call this a 1,000th block. So here are our base 10 blocks. You could see that the large cube is the 1 block. As a decimal, it's represented as 1 or 1.0. The flat is a 10th block because it takes 10 of them to make the 1 block. And as a decimal, you can write it as 0.1. The rod is a 100th because it takes 100 of those rods to make up the big cube. And you could represent it as 0.01. And the tiny little cube represents 1,000th because it takes 1,000 of them to make up the full big block. And as a decimal, you can represent it as 0.001. I want you to see if you notice a connection here with our decimal and our fraction. Look at a tenth. Doesn't it kind of look like the number 10 backwards if you ignore the decimal point? Look at the 100th block, or the 100th. Doesn't it look like the number 100 backwards if you ignore the decimal? And how about the 1,000th? Doesn't that look like the number 1,000 backwards if you remove the decimal? Okay, now I've got my place value chart down here below. And let's look at an example. So some people might call this number down here below as 1.234. But the correct way to read this number, the correct mathematical way, is 1 and 234 thousandths. Do you notice that the word and is used to represent the decimal? That's the only time when it's okay to use the word and, is when it's representing the decimal. Here is expanded form. So that's another way to show that number. Here is what it would actually look like in base 10 blocks. So we have 1 ones, 2 tenths, 3 hundredths, and 4 thousandths.